One of the rants that I'd have about economics at this point would be simply that most of the discussion still seems to focus on an analysis that compares the modern market to 1970s deflation, stagflation, sorry, and also, all of the focus is now ultimately, a lot of the focus anyways is on this idea that the government debt is too high and everything. And you know I'm per the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, look what's happening to US household debt. And we divide it up. So we've got mortgages going up, we've got auto loans going up, we've got student loan debts going up, and we've got these credit card loans going up as well. And all that rising, 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 rising until you've got a massive $18.2 trillion debt in US households. you know US corporate debt. Let's look at those kinds of charts. So US, so this is the US corporate debt and GDP, rates that are going up. The charting of these corporations and the debt that is going up, 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 up. Non-financial corporate debt as a percentage of GDP exceeds peak prior. So, it's up, 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 and has been for years, although this is very old data at this point. So, what the hell? When was this article written? Okay, so it's actually come down in recent years, the corporate side of things, but, at least per that data. So we're seeing this, from 2008, that it was 2018, it was still up, the ballooning. So, there's a lot of over leveraged corporations that are very, very high on debt as well in the system, and yet all of the focus goes towards, the US, national deficit and the national debt that is accrued by the US government itself, as though the US government itself is the only party that has behaved fiscally irresponsibly, and that the consequences of that fiscally irresponsible behavior would only fall, and are of all the fiscal irresponsibility in the system will come only from the U.S. government itself, basically. Like the aggregate impact of it is all gonna come from Uncle Sam's misbehavior, not the fact that you know. So I came forward and I made a mistake in economics. I told you years prior that I felt that the inflation was likely transitory in nature. That is not an analysis that I am rethinking, really. I stand by it, but the whole problem that I now see that has made my analysis turn sour is that this inflation is transitory, but for all the wrong reasons. And what led me to that conclusion, it was essentially this chart. It was also just that I would like to ultimately remind you about what happened to housing prices when the liquidity when the financial crisis actually first started back in 2018. That drives me, well, not 2018, I mean like 2008, in 2007, circa, what happened. Home prices dropped by about 20%, between September 2006 and September 2009. You know, so between September 2006. God damn it! Why do I do this with numbers? And December 2009. God. Oh, I hate it. I mispronunciations all the fucking time with them. I have to keep the shit straight. I fucking hate, doing numbers from, my being in my head to being out loud. I hate it, trying to pronounce them. But no, I mean, home prices fell by about 20% as a result in the Great Recession, and basically that's the basis of the turnaround, because what I've been saying here on this channel for the longest time is that debts have an inherently deflationary impact on the macro economy. Either people are paying off debts, in which case they aren't spending the money to buy up goods and services, or they're causing shocks to the counterparty that's in the credit by defaulting on the debt, which changes the whole credit market, because when you have delinquencies on the rise, then what ends up happening is that creditors will start to tighten lending standards, and they will lend to less and less people, and the few people they do lend to, they'll demand greater amounts of money from, because they see the economy as at risk ultimately. And so the fact that people have behaved incredibly irresponsibly in our economy and our system is a massive deflationary risk that is almost inevitable because of appallingly irresponsible behavior on behalf of U.S. households and corporations and everything. And what I would point to here with this massive run up in household debt that's spiked all the way to 18.2 trillion in the first quarter of this year and everything, and point at that, I would say that what this is telling me is that the reason that the inflation has proven to be more stubborn than expected is a very sour one that is very bad for the health of the economy, that will likely lead to a credit crunch as a consequence of all of it, and this, a liquidity crisis is triggered by that credit crunch. And this also comes at a bad time when the bond market sell-off has happened, and yields are high, which is also causing a problem in which stocks are less attractive when the very low risk bonds and their yields are quite high. So this pullout is making stocks far less attractive to investors as a consequence, and so that also is a pretty nasty impact for the price of the price of stocks at the end of the day. Like that's a big problem for stock prices, because now essentially there's a high yielding and low risk scenario in the bond market that's even now, even with the government as indebted as it is, for everybody, because if the U.S. government were to ever default on that, that would be a catastrophe for the global economy. But as I was trying to say and getting to in this, this behavior has been completely irresponsible. And so what we know from this kind of data is that the reason that inflation has proven to be more stubborn than expected is because people were running out, and how were they paying for the price increases on the price of food and services, food and services, and basically energy prices. Well, they were filling their cars up with their credit cards. They were they were paying for their groceries with their credit cards. They were deciding to put it all on credit. And now the bill has come due, and many people and delinquencies are on the rise, which will cause liquidity to freeze up because people won't be able to get loans. And so to you who think that the dollar is toilet paper and have compared it over and over again and said it is worthless and compared, only Americans think this. Like, they're the only ones, because all around the world and all the black markets, that exist all over the world, what are goods and services paid for in those countries? If you're on the streets of Buenos Aires and you're walking around out there and in Argentina and everything on the streets, what are you going to pay for your shit with? Usually it's going to be the US dollar that functions. I mean, all this unofficial activity that isn't on the books, because it's all around the world seen as the safe haven, asset, and on top of all of these things that I'm pointing out toward to you, like the frustration that I feel, okay? Like, people, we now know why this inflation wasn't as transitory as expected. It's because people have been doing something completely unsustainable, which is to go out and pay for the increase in grocery prices on credit cards and load up on credit card debt. So, axiom, debt that can't be repaid will never be repaid. And with that, that is the match that will light the kerosene and cause the deflationary crisis that's predicted. In the long run, do I know when this will hit? No, but I mean, look, delinquencies are going the wrong way. They're going up, and is it a systematic risk yet? Not yet, but it's moving in the direction towards being a systematic risk to the economy. It's getting worse and worse and worse, and it's going from bad to worse now, at this point, especially with this new shock that is opening up with, now all of these distressed households are now also having to pay off their student loans. So, that shock of them trying to collect on those now is going to cause delinquencies to go up even further. And, we are now inches away from this turning into a crisis that is a systematic risk to the whole fucking economy. And what happens when, and why is all of this so incredibly worrying at the end of the day? Because almost all the chatter about finance and economics has been to pour into gold, silver, and Bitcoin. That's been the advocacy that has been out there. And what happens to those assets in a deflationary spiral? Well, let me tell you, they don't tend to do pretty well. They might sputter, and flatline and go nowhere. But a lot of times when, you have a deflationary scenario, gold plummets, silver plummets. They go down with the dollar. No. They go down with the prices of everything else as the dollar goes up, in value. Well, anyways, the dollar may sit at exactly 99 on the DXY, but if prices collapse now as a consequence of all of this, and why do I say that? It's because people are going out and buying things on their credit cards. Well, we had a situation in which the people that were producing these goods and services had high input cost, and yet, despite the increase in the supply chain problems, and despite the supply chain problems, demand remained quite high for these goods and services. But how did they remain high? How was that happening? People were paying for their necessities with credit cards. That's how. They were stretching their budgets that way, and now that the bills are starting to come due, many of these U.S. consumers are not actually paying their credit card debts. They're just going into default and delinquency as a result of it. And the frustration for me is that most people don't understand what the macroeconomic effect of debt defaults actually is. They look at that and they think that's the credibility of the dollar going out the window, and it's like, no, it's the birth of a liquidity crisis that is also made worse by the sell-off in the bond market, which is aggravating it as well. It basically let the impact of credit of defaults on people's debts. When people stop paying them, the creditors, they freeze up. They start to get very reluctant to lend money. They start lending less of it into the economy, and then what happens, is that, as a result of all of this, prices start to fall, because it impacts demand when people can't use it to stimulate. You can't use debt to stimulate, demand for products, and then, because they start to fall, people start losing their jobs, and because, people start losing their jobs, demand goes down further, and, thus prices start to fall further, more people lose their jobs, prices start to fall further, more people lose their jobs, and it just turns into a vicious fucking cycle, which is why, the Federal Reserve and the government has been absolutely terrified of that scenario. But, looking now at what's happening to the U.S. households and household debt and all of this, it's looking like a crisis is starting to unfold, and that it will, you know, th- it's been made inevitable by people basically not behaving responsibly with their credit cards. They didn't go out and spend their credit buying, they didn't use it to finance like purchases that might, lead to them producing anything. They just used it to keep consuming, and now many of them aren't paying.